When something feels wrong, it doesn't stop gnawing at you. It stays there, quiet, steady, until it forces you to face it. That's how it was with Emily. The more I looked, the more I saw, and the angrier I became. I started watching her more closely. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't help it. The woman I trusted, the one I thought I knew better than anyone, was slipping through my fingers. It wasn't just the late nights anymore. She began missing family dinners completely, claiming she was stuck at work or meeting up with friends. "You're always at work," I snapped one evening. "You're telling me it's gotten so bad you can't even spend an hour with your kids?" Her face hardened, but she didn't argue. "I'll try harder," she said. That was it. No explanation, no apology. Just a hollow promise I already knew she wouldn't keep. And then there was her phone. It was always within arm's reach, face down on the table or tucked away in her bag. If it buzzed, she'd glance at it quickly, shutting the screen before I could see anything. One night, as we were sitting on the couch, it buzzed twice in quick succession. I glanced over instinctively, but before I could even register the name, she snatched it up and walked into the kitchen. "What's so important?" I called after her. "Just work stuff," she replied, her voice muffled. "Work stuff." Sure. That same week, I noticed another shift. Emily had always been meticulous about her appearance, but lately, she was dressing differently. New clothes, a little more revealing than usual, and makeup that seemed to have a purpose. She'd leave the house looking like she was ready for a date, not a casual night out with friends. Who's dressing up for girls' night these days? I muttered to myself as I watched her walk out the door. Then there was the cologne. That scent came back, faint but unmistakable. This time, I didn't say anything. Instead, I followed her coat into the laundry room and checked the pockets. Empty. But as I hung it back up, my hand brushed against the lining, and I felt something, paper, thin and folded. A receipt. Not for groceries or gas, but for dinner at a restaurant I'd never heard of. A fancy place downtown, the kind you only go to if you're trying to impress someone. The date was from 2 nights prior, one of her so-called late work meetings. By this point, I wasn't just suspicious. I was angry. I wanted answers, but I also knew Emily wasn't going to give them to me willingly. The next day, I decided to test her. "Hey," I said casually over breakfast, "I was thinking we could plan that road trip we've been talking about. Maybe this summer?" She didn't even look up from her coffee. "This summer's too busy," she said, her tone flat. "Maybe next year." I stared at her, waiting for her to say more, but she didn't. Just sipped her coffee and scrolled through her phone like I wasn't even there. Too busy with what? I pressed. "Work," she said without missing a beat. "You know how it is?" I didn't know how it was, and that was the problem. Later that evening, I decided to search her car. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but at this point I didn't care about playing nice. If she was hiding something, I was going to find it. In the center console, I found a business card for a hotel. Not a receipt this time, just a card, but the name printed on it sent a jolt through me. Dr. Maynard Gilmore. I remembered meeting him once, briefly, at one of Emily's work events. He was charming, the kind of guy who shook your hand like he was doing you a favor. I'd thought nothing of it at the time, but now it felt like a clue. I stared at the card, my jaw tightening. When Emily got home that night, I didn't waste any time. "What's this?" I asked, holding up the card. She froze, just for a second, before forcing a laugh. "Oh, Maynard probably left that in the car when I gave him a ride the other day. He needed a lift to a conference." "A ride?" I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. "You've never mentioned driving him anywhere before." She waved it off. It wasn't a big deal, just a one-time thing. Her explanation might have worked if I didn't already know better. But now, I was certain something was going on, and it involved her and Maynard Gilmore. I wanted to push her further, to call her out right then and there, but I held back. If I was going to confront her, I needed more than just a hunch. That's when I decided to take things into my own hands. When trust is shattered, it doesn't break cleanly. It splinters, leaving sharp edges that cut deeper with every new discovery. I didn't want to keep digging, but at this point, I knew I had no choice. After finding the hotel business card, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily had been lying to me for months, maybe longer. I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I was angry. And the more I thought about Dr. Maynard Gilmore, the more it all started to make sense. The late nights, the new clothes, the smell of cologne that wasn't mine. But I needed proof, something she couldn't talk her way out of. The first step was simple. Emily had mentioned that she occasionally drove Maynard to conferences or meetings. I decided to verify her story. I called the hotel whose card I'd found in her car, pretending to confirm a booking. After some initial resistance, the receptionist mentioned a Dr. Maynard Gilmore had recently stayed there. My stomach twisted when she added, "Oh yes, he checked in with a guest, Ms. Emily Wright." It felt like someone had driven a nail into my chest. I hung up, pacing the kitchen as the words repeated in my head. Checked in with a guest. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real. She wasn't coming home late because of work or spending time with friends. She was with him. That evening, I searched her phone. I'd never been the kind of man to snoop, but the rules had changed. Emily left it charging on the counter while she showered. My hands shook as I unlocked it. She'd been careless enough to keep the same passcode for years. The messages I found were worse than I'd imagined. There they were, texts from Maynard. "Last night was amazing," one read. Another said, "I can't stop thinking about you." My stomach churned as I scrolled further. The messages didn't just confirm the affair. They painted a picture of a relationship filled with intimacy and excitement, the kind I hadn't seen from Emily in years. Photos followed. They weren't explicit, but they were damning, shots of them together at a restaurant on what looked like a weekend getaway. One image showed them sitting close, his hand resting on her knee. I felt like a fool. All those times she'd smiled at me, kissed me goodbye, told me she loved me. It had all been a lie. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. At work, I snapped at my assistant for something trivial and left early. I drove home, parked a few houses down, and waited. Emily had said she was meeting friends for dinner, but I wasn't buying it. Sure enough, just after 7, Maynard's car pulled into the driveway. He got out first, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. Emily followed, laughing softly as she locked the door behind her. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My first instinct was to march up to the door and tear the place apart, but I stopped myself. If I confronted her now, she'd just deny everything. I needed to be smart about this. The next step was hiring a private investigator. I didn't like the idea, but I knew it was the only way to get the evidence I needed. Over the next week, the investigator confirmed what I already knew. Emily and Maynard weren't exactly discreet. They met regularly, sometimes at the hospital, other times at the same hotel. The photos he sent me were undeniable. Emily walking into Maynard's car, their hands brushing as they entered a restaurant, the two of them sitting close in a dimly lit bar. But the real bombshell came when the investigator shared a recording. He'd overheard them at a cafe, discussing plans for a weekend getaway. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Emily said. "Liam's been asking questions." "Don't worry," Maynard replied. "We'll figure it out." That was it. I'd heard enough. I didn't wait for Emily to come home that night. Instead, I went into our bedroom, opened her closet, and started packing her things. I didn't care what she said or how she tried to spin it. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was an insult to everything we'd built together. When she finally walked through the door, she froze at the sight of the suitcase on the bed. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp with panic. "Packing," I said coldly. "For you." She stared at me, her face pale. "Liam, what are you talking about?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the folder with the photos, and held it up. "Explain this." Her eyes widened as she looked at the screen. For a moment, she said nothing, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words. "Liam, it's not what you think," she started, her voice trembling. "It's exactly what I think," I snapped, my voice rising. "You've been sneaking around with him for months. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." The color drained from her face, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. She stammered something about work stress, about how she didn't mean for any of this to happen, but I didn't care. "You lied to me," I said, my voice hard. "You lied to our kids. Did you even think about them while you were off with him? Or were they just another inconvenience?" Her tears didn't move me. For years, I'd been the patient one, the calm one, the man who always gave her the benefit of the doubt. But this was unforgivable. By the time I was done, Emily wasn't just crying. She was begging. But it didn't matter. I'd made up my mind. When Emily walked through the door that night, I was already sitting at the kitchen table, the photos and messages spread out in front of me like evidence in a courtroom. I'd poured myself a glass of whiskey to keep my hands from shaking. Not from nerves, but from anger. She froze when she saw me, her keys still in her hand. For a second, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes before she masked it with that same casual indifference she'd been using for months. "You're up late," she said, trying to sound normal. "I think we need to talk," I replied, my voice calm but ice cold. Her eyes darted to the table, and the color drained from her face when she saw the photos. She didn't move, didn't even blink. For a moment, it was as if she thought standing still would make the evidence disappear. "Emily," I said, leaning forward, "explain this." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her bag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor with a dull thud. Finally, she stammered, "Liam, I don't know what you think this is, but don't." I cut her off, slamming my hand on the table. The sound made her flinch. "Don't insult me by pretending. I'm not an idiot, and I'm not going to sit here and listen to your lies." Her lips trembled as she glanced at the photos again. "It's not what you think," she whispered. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. "Then what is it, Emily? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife has been sneaking around with another man. It looks like she's been lying to my face for months." She took a step back, tears welling in her eyes. "Liam, please, let me explain." "Oh, I can't wait to hear this," I said, crossing my arms. "Go ahead. Explain how dinner dates, hotel stays, and love notes from Maynard Gilmore aren't what they seem." At the mention of his name, her composure cracked. She looked down, her hands twisting together as if she could wring the guilt from her fingers. "It just happened," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "It just happened?" I repeated, my anger boiling over. "What does that even mean, Emily? Affairs don't just happen. You made a choice, a conscious decision, to betray me, to betray our family." She started crying then, big, heaving sobs that might have moved me once. But now, they just felt hollow. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said through her tears. "I was lonely, Liam. You've been so busy with work, and I felt invisible." I barked out a laugh, the sound bitter and sharp. "Invisible? Is that your excuse? I've been working my ass off to provide for this family. And you repay me by running off with another man? Save your crocodile tears, Emily. I'm not buying it." Her sobs turned to anger then, her tears drying as she straightened up. "You think this is all on me?" she snapped. "You've been so focused on your job, your routines. You don't even see me anymore. Maynard, he made me feel alive again." "Alive?" I shot back. "You felt alive while you were lying to me? While you were sneaking around behind my back? Don't stand there and blame me for your lack of morals, Emily." She flinched, her defiance faltering. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice small now. "But you did," I said, my voice hard. "You hurt me. You hurt our kids. Did you even think about them while you were off playing house with him? Or were they just another inconvenience?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. But I didn't feel sorry for her, not anymore. "Is it over?" I asked, my tone flat. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "Get out," I said, pointing toward the door. "Liam, please," she begged, stepping closer. "Don't do this. We can fix this. I love you." "You love me," I repeated, laughing bitterly. "That's rich, coming from the woman who's been cheating on me. You don't love me, Emily. You love yourself. You love the thrill of sneaking around and getting away with it." Tears streamed down her face as she sank into a chair. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say goodbye," I said coldly. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "You can't mean that." "I mean every word," I said. "This marriage is over. Pack your things and go." She tried to argue, tried to plead with me, but I was done listening. I grabbed the suitcase I'd packed for her and shoved it toward her. "Liam, please," she said one last time, her voice breaking. "Don't throw away everything we've built. You threw it away the moment you decided he was worth more than your family, I said. She stared at me for a long moment, as if searching for some sign of weakness, some crack she could exploit. But I didn't give her one. Finally, she picked up the suitcase and walked toward the door. I followed her, watching as she stepped outside and paused. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't reply. I just closed the door and locked it behind her. When the door closed behind Emily, I didn't collapse into a heap or wallow in self-pity. That wasn't me. She'd already stolen enough from me, my trust, my time, my belief that we were building something real. The way I saw it, I had two choices: let her keep taking or take back control. I chose the latter. The first thing I did was grab her laptop. Emily might have been careful with her phone, but she never thought to password protect her computer. Within minutes, I was combing through her emails, calendar, and files. It didn't take long to find confirmation of what I already knew. There were messages to and from Maynard, some casual, some not so much. One stood out in particular, a draft she'd saved but hadn't sent. It read, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Liam's been asking questions. Maybe it's time to tell him the truth." The arrogance of it made my blood boil. She wasn't just unfaithful. She was sloppy. I forwarded the damning emails to myself, creating a folder of evidence. But I wasn't just collecting this for my own satisfaction. I had bigger plans. Plans that would ensure Emily and Maynard couldn't walk away from this unscathed. My next move was calling my lawyer, Pete Anderson. Pete wasn't just any attorney. He was a shark, the kind of man who could tear someone apart in court without breaking a sweat. I explained the situation, giving him a rundown of what I'd found and what I wanted to accomplish. "I'm not just looking for a divorce," I said, my voice hard. "I want custody of the kids. I want to protect my assets. And I want our reputation to take a hit where it matters." Pete chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You've come to the right place," he said. The first order of business was freezing our joint accounts. Emily had been handling the finances for years, but I wasn't about to let her drain them before the paperwork was signed. Pete guided me through the process, ensuring that every dollar we'd earned together was accounted for. While Pete worked on the legal side, I turned my attention to the social aspect. Emily had spent years building her image as a devoted wife, a caring mother, and a respected nurse. That image was about to crumble. I didn't go around shouting about the affair from the rooftops. No, that would have been too easy to dismiss as bitterness from a scorned husband. Instead, I let the evidence speak for itself. It started with a few carefully placed conversations. A quiet word to the head of the PDA about Emily's relationship with a certain doctor. A casual mention to a neighbor about how she'd been spending her work trips. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. Within a week, the phone calls started. Friends, colleagues, even a few of her relatives reached out, their voices dripping with faux concern. "Is everything okay, Liam? We've been hearing things." I didn't confirm or deny anything outright. I just let out a heavy sigh and said, "It's been a difficult time for the family." People filled in the blanks on their own, and I didn't feel the least bit guilty about it. Meanwhile, Emily was struggling to maintain control of the narrative. She called me a dozen times, alternating between tearful apologies and furious accusations. I ignored every single one. Let her stew. Let her realize that the power dynamic had shifted. For years, I let her call the shots. I trusted her to manage our finances, our schedules, our life together. That trust was gone now, and with it went any sense of obligation I'd felt to protect her. My focus was on the kids. Brad Jr. and Bridget were too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, but they could sense the tension. I made it a point to spend as much time with them as possible, ensuring they felt safe and loved. At the same time, I started documenting everything. Every interaction with Emily, every piece of evidence I collected, every instance where her actions showed neglect or irresponsibility. Pete assured me that this would be crucial in securing custody. "Family court isn't about punishing infidelity," he said. "It's about showing who's the better parent. And with what you've got, that's you." Hearing those words gave me a renewed sense of purpose. Emily had taken so much from me, but she wasn't going to take the kids. I'd make sure of that. But custody battles and court proceedings were only part of my plan. The other part was making sure that Emily and Maynard's little love affair didn't escape unscathed. I started small, planting seeds of doubt among her coworkers. A strategically timed email to her supervisor included a few of the less flattering messages between her and Maynard. I framed it as a concerned husband seeking advice, knowing full well it would set tongues wagging at the clinic. By the end of the week, Emily's perfect life was beginning to show cracks. She called me again, this time leaving a voicemail that teetered between anger and desperation. "You don't have to do this, Liam," she said, her voice shaking. "We can talk. We can fix this." But there was nothing to fix. She'd made her choices, and now she was going to live with the consequences. I've always believed revenge is best served cold, and this was no exception. Emily had taken everything I held sacred and tossed it aside for her own selfish desires. Now, it was my turn to act, and I wasn't about to hold back. The first step was tightening my grip on our shared finances. With Pete's help, I froze every joint account and transferred my paychecks into a separate account in my name. Emily had grown too comfortable with financial control, and it was time she realized what life without my support felt like. I knew she'd notice eventually, but I wanted to catch her off guard. Sure enough, a few days later, she called me, her voice laced with irritation. "Liam, I tried to pay for groceries and the card got declined. What's going on?" "Figured you'd start handling your own expenses," I replied, keeping my tone calm. "After all, you've been independent enough to manage your own extracurricular activities. Seems fair, doesn't it?" The silence on the other end told me my point had landed. Next, I turned my attention to her professional life. Emily had spent years cultivating an image as a dedicated nurse and compassionate caregiver, but the truth had a way of surfacing when the right people were nudged. I started with an email to the hospital's HR department. The subject line was innocuous enough: concerns about workplace conduct. In the body, I included a few choice screenshots of her texts with Maynard, framing it as an issue of professionalism. I didn't outright accuse them of misconduct. That would have been too direct. Instead, I posed it as a question. "I'm unsure if this is something you're already aware of, but it felt important to share." It didn't take long for the ripple effect to start. A colleague of hers, someone I'd met at a holiday party years ago, reached out under the guise of checking in. "You know, Liam," she said cautiously, "Emily's been acting different at work lately. People are starting to notice." "Different how?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Well, there have been rumors," she hesitated, then added, "about her and Dr. Gilmore. It's not my place to say more, but maybe you should talk to her." I thanked her politely, knowing full well the damage had already begun. Meanwhile, the private investigator continued feeding me valuable ammunition. Among the new findings was a series of hotel receipts tied to Maynard's corporate credit card, with Emily's name listed as a guest. This wasn't just evidence for my case. It was a bomb waiting to go off in their professional circle. I made sure it did. A friend of mine, an old college buddy who worked in the local medical field, accidentally forwarded one of those receipts to a few key figures at Maynard's hospital. Within days, whispers turned into outright speculation, and Emily's once spotless reputation was in tatters. Her calls to me became more frantic. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded one evening. "You don't have to ruin my life." "Ruin your life?" I repeated, my voice steady. "You manage that all on your own, Emily. I'm just making sure everyone sees the truth." By this point, her social life was also unraveling. The neighbors she used to chat with during walks around the block started avoiding her. Even her own friends seemed to be distancing themselves, no doubt embarrassed by their association with her. But the final blow came during a parent-teacher fundraiser at the kids' school. Emily had agreed to volunteer, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. I arrived late, deliberately drawing attention as I entered the room. Several parents gave me sympathetic nods, their eyes lingering just a bit too long on Emily, who was stationed at the refreshment table. As I made my way across the room, I overheard snippets of conversation. "Such a shame," one mother whispered. "And with a doctor, no less," another added. Emily must have heard it too, because when our eyes met, hers were filled with panic. I didn't say a word, just let the moment hang there, heavy and damning. That night, She called again, this time leaving a voicemail. Her voice cracked as she said, "I don't even recognize you anymore, Liam. This isn't who you are." She was wrong. This was exactly who I was, a man who refused to be made a fool of. As the weeks went on, Emily's world continued to collapse. Maynard, ever the coward, distanced himself as the scrutiny grew. Their affair, once so thrilling and secretive, became an albatross around her neck. Meanwhile, I stayed focused on the kids. Brad Jr. and Bridget didn't need to know all the details, but they deserved stability, and I was determined to give it to them. Pete assured me that with the evidence I gathered, custody would be a slam dunk. By the time our first court hearing rolled around, Emily was a shadow of her former self, nervous, defensive, and visibly unraveling. I, on the other hand, walked in with my head held high, knowing I'd done everything in my power to protect my family. And I wasn't done yet. Court hearings aren't made for drama, but sometimes the truth turns even the driest legal proceedings into a spectacle. When I walked into the courtroom for the custody hearing, I wasn't nervous. I was prepared. Months of planning had led to this moment, and I was confident Pete had the case locked down. Emily, on the other hand, looked like she'd aged a decade. Gone was the polished, composed woman who used to command a room. She sat slumped at her table, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. The evidence Pete presented was airtight. The photographs, the hotel receipts, the text messages. All of it painted a clear picture of a woman who had prioritized her affair over her family. But what sealed the deal wasn't the evidence. It was Emily herself. Under questioning, she stumbled over her words, contradicting herself multiple times. When Pete brought up her financial negligence, showing how she'd funneled money into secret trips with Maynard, her composure cracked completely. "I was trying to fix my life," she blurted out, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Pete didn't even blink. "And yet it did, Mrs. Wright," he said coolly, turning to the judge. "The facts speak for themselves." By the time the judge ruled in my favor, granting me full custody of Brad Jr. and Bridget, Emily looked like she might collapse. I didn't feel sorry for her, not after everything she'd done. But as I watched her walk out of the courtroom, shoulders hunched and face pale, I couldn't help but wonder how she had fallen so far. The answer came a week later. It started with a call from a mutual acquaintance, someone who still worked at the hospital. "Liam," she began, hesitating, "I thought you should know. Maynard's been let go." "Let go?" I asked, surprised. "Fired," she clarified. "There was an investigation, and, well, it turns out Emily wasn't the only one he was seeing. There were others. Patients' family members, nurses, even a junior doctor. It's a mess." I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Emily had traded her family for a man who couldn't even keep his lies straight. But the real twist came when I found out why she'd been clinging so desperately to Maynard. Apparently, their relationship wasn't just personal, it was financial. Emily had taken out a loan in her name to cover one of Maynard's supposed investments, a scheme that had turned out to be as fake as his charm. When she showed up at my door a few days later, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked tired, broken, and for the first time, genuinely ashamed. "Liam," she said quietly, "I need to talk to you." "I don't think we have anything left to say," I replied, crossing my arms. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "It's about the kids." That got my attention. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me to keep the kids from overhearing. "What about them?" I asked. She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "I know I messed up," she said. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want to be in their lives. I'll do whatever it takes." Her desperation was palpable, but so was my resolve. "You had your chance, Emily," I said coldly. "You chose Maynard over this family, and now you're dealing with the consequences. The court has ruled, and I'm not about to disrupt the kids' lives because you suddenly regret your decisions." Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't reply. I just turned and walked back inside, locking the door behind me. From that point on, Emily's life continued its downward spiral. Without Maynard or her job at the hospital, she was forced to move out of town. The few mutual friends who hadn't already distanced themselves from her finally cut ties after learning about the financial scandal. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding. My priority was the kids, making sure they felt safe and loved despite everything that had happened. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward. A few weeks later, I ran into Megan, an old friend from college. She'd heard about the divorce and offered her support. What started as a simple conversation turned into something more, and for the first time, I allowed myself to think about the possibility of a future without the shadow of betrayal hanging over me. Emily's name still came up occasionally, usually in whispers or passing comments from those who'd heard about her latest misfortunes. But I didn't dwell on it. She was no longer a part of my life, and that was exactly how I wanted it. It's been months since Emily walked out of our lives, and every day since then, I've been piecing things back together. I won't lie and say it was easy. There were nights when the silence in the house felt deafening, even with the kids asleep upstairs. There were mornings when the weight of everything hit me so hard I could barely get out of bed. But here's the thing about life. It doesn't stop just because you've been blindsided. You have to get up, and that's exactly what I did. The kids were my first priority. Bridget, my youngest, amazed me with her resilience. At 10 years old, she threw herself into her schoolwork and her art projects as if nothing had changed. She started drawing these beautiful, vibrant pictures of our family, me, her, Brad Jr., always with big smiles. It was her way of telling me, we're going to be okay. But Brad Jr., at 14, was a different story. He wasn't a little boy anymore, and he understood more than I wanted him to. He started asking tough questions, ones I couldn't always answer. Why did Mom leave? Was it something we did? Those conversations were the hardest. How do you explain to your son that it wasn't his fault? That it wasn't about him at all? One night, as I was tucking him in, he asked me quietly, "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" I sat on the edge of his bed, meeting his worried eyes. "We're not just going to be okay," I said firmly. "We're going to be better. You'll see." And I meant it. That moment was a turning point for me. From then on, every decision I made wasn't just about rebuilding my life. It was about creating a future where my kids could thrive. I rearranged my work schedule to make sure I was there for every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference, every late-night homework meltdown. But it wasn't just about showing up. It was about being present. As for Emily, I won't pretend she didn't cross my mind from time to time. There were moments when I wondered if I'd gone too far. Revenge is a double-edged sword, after all. Watching her world crumble had felt satisfying at the time, but it didn't undo the damage she'd done. Still, I had no regrets. Every once in a while, I'd hear about her through the grapevine. She'd moved out of town, scraping by with a part-time job and trying to piece her life together. Maynard, unsurprisingly, was long gone. His charm hadn't held up under scrutiny, and he'd moved on to someone new, or so I'd heard. The irony wasn't lost on me. Emily had thrown everything away for a man who couldn't even stick around. But what surprised me most was how quickly the pieces of my own life started falling back into place once I stopped dwelling on the past. My focus shifted entirely to what mattered: my kids, my career, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd weathered the storm. And then there was Megan. I'd known Megan since college, though we'd lost touch over the years. Running into her at the grocery store a few months ago had been unexpected but welcome. At first, it was just small talk, catching up on old times, trading stories about work and family. But as the weeks went on, we started meeting up more often. Megan was everything Emily wasn't. Honest, grounded. She had this warmth about her that put me at ease, something I hadn't felt in years. She wasn't trying to impress anyone or pretend to be someone she wasn't. The first time she met the kids, I was nervous. I didn't want to rush anything or make them feel like I was trying to replace their mom. But Megan handled it perfectly. We spent the afternoon at the park, where she played tag with Bridget and helped Brad Jr. with his football throw. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it didn't need to be. It was simple, real. For the first time in a long time, I felt hope. Of course, moving forward hasn't been without its challenges. There are still moments when the past tries to claw its way back in. An old photo, a casual mention of Emily from someone who doesn't know the full story. But those moments don't hold the same power they once did. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that betrayal doesn't define you. It's how you respond to it that matters. I could have let Emily's actions consume me. I could have become bitter, angry, the kind of man who spends the rest of his life stewing over what he's lost. But I chose differently. I chose to fight for my kids, to protect them from the fallout of her mistakes. I chose to rebuild, even when it felt impossible. And in doing so, I discovered something I hadn't realized I'd lost: myself. To anyone listening to this who's been where I've been, let me tell you this. Don't let someone else's betrayal dictate your life. Take back control. Focus on what matters. And remember, the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about moving on, living well, and proving to yourself that you're stronger than they gave you credit for. Emily is no longer a part of our lives, and I've made peace with that. My world now revolves around the people who matter: my kids, my friends, and maybe someday Megan. Life doesn't stop because of heartbreak. It keeps moving, whether you're ready or not. And for the first time in a long time, I'm not just keeping up. I'm looking forward to where the road will take me.